Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today is Wednesday, the day before the American Thanksgiving holiday. Us Canadians celebrate that last month. But today I'm going to talk about something a little out of the ordinary for me. Rock and roll. And everything is interwoven in the history of the 20th century of music. So it's really not that far from, the black tradition that I talk about most of the time. But that being said, oftentimes when I find myself in a place where I know I'm going to be stuck for several hours, a bus ride back years ago, a party where things are kind of like, this is dry, a contractor's over working on some plumbing, and he's a music guy. This is something I like to use as a conversation starter, and there's not a right or wrong answer to this. It's very subjective. There's a lot of nuance, opinion. However, I'm trying to be as objective as possible. And the question I'm going to put before you today is, what is the greatest American rock and roll band of all time? We're talking rock and roll, classic rock forward, so that excludes all the R&B, blues, black tradition. So don't be saying Prince, don't be saying Michael Jackson. That's not part of this element we're talking. We're talking white rock and roll music for the most part. It doesn't have to be white, but just rock and roll music. And remember, rock and roll is very much a descendant of rhythm and blues and the blues. And early rhythm and blues, rock and roll stuff is very interchangeable. You can buy a record saying the greatest rock and roll songs of 1948, and it's rhythm and blues basically. And rock and roll, rhythm and blues didn't really get us a foothold in America in the charts until it went to England and the British kids brought it here. And then we loved that British music, which was black music. And I'm going to show you all this as I go through some records here. First, so none of the black music counts in terms of what we're talking about right now. So what is the greatest American rock and roll band? And the shocking thing is, most people I think are like, oh, that's easy. And then you realize everything you're about to say is British. Also, we're not going to include solo artists. So, your Leonard Cohen's, who's a Canadian actually. Your Bob Dylan's. Your Bob Dylan's, who I'm a big Bob Dylan fan. I have pretty much all of his work. Not like Bob Bowser has all his work, but I got most of Dylan's work. Your Simon and Garfunkel's not a band. It's not a rock and roll band. Big fan, Simon Garfunkel, don't get me wrong. Tom Waits, he's not a rock and roll. He's jazz beatnik, Bruce Springsteen. He kind of is on the border of being a band, but he also kind of does his own thing at times, and the E Street's not on all of his records, if I remember. Neil Young and Crazy Horse kind of fits that same category, but again, Neil's a Canadian, so we're not going to count him. The band, one of the greatest bands of all time, and they're in my top 10, but 4/5 Canadian once again, and their first two records are just legendary Hall of Fame records. The Guess Who had a couple of really great songs and a long career. Canadian. And so we're going to look now at what I think are the top 10. Again, the band would probably be in my top 10. But for most, listen, these aren't in any specific order. But for most people's perspectives, the greatest bands of all time are the Beatles. Can't really argue that. The Rolling Stones. Again, if you argue that, you're not going to do yourself any favors. Led Zeppelin. And the Beatles, the Stones, and Led Zeppelin are all rooted firmly in American black music. Queen, who, for my vote, is one of the most innovative rock groups. They take the blues and the roots of rock and roll, but they have some really interesting composition and creativity to it. Pink Floyd, undoubtedly one of the great rock and roll groups. Of course, they merge into other kind of genres and subgenres, but Pink Floyd is one of the greatest bands of all time without question. Fleetwood Mac, I'm not the biggest Fleetwood Mac fan, but their sales, their legendary middle of the road sound, their accessibility to guys and girls alike. It's pretty hard to deny Fleetwood Mac's probably one of the greatest bands of all time. The Who. I don't love The Who as much as I once loved The Who. But when it comes to explosivity and a lot of what rock and roll is, The Who embody a lot of that as good as anybody does. Black Sabbath. Huge innovators. So many people came along and followed Sabbath. Probably they're in the top 10. This is probably the one that's most easy to take out of this top 10 will be Cream. Supergroup, incredibly talented, but only 3 or 4 record legacy. So it's a little bit tougher to say, yeah, they're definitely in the group. And the Kinks. Again, I'm not the biggest Kinks fan. I like what I got. Waterloo Sunset, there's some tracks I really am a fan of. But there's a lot of Kink fans out there. Their records sold for a long time. They're probably certainly in a lot of people's top 10 rock groups of all time. None of those were all British bands right there. And I'm going to show you some other groups that people would think of to add to this list. And none of these groups are American. Bowie and the Spiders from Mars. And again, Bowie's kind of that more of a solo artist with bands behind him. T-Rex, great band, made some great records, but not in that top 10 status. Big Traffic fan. Steve Winwood's a really brilliant player. ELO, again, British. Dave Clark 5. Big fan of Erica Burden and the Animals, but they don't belong on the top 10. Badfinger, great stuff. The Zombies, the Hollies. These are all great British bands. Moving into the 80s now, the Police are one of the greatest bands of all time, without any question to my mind. As are U2. I think they made a lot of impact, and they have several different eras of their career with the same 4 guys. I was watching a video on YouTube the other day, and they talked about how through various lineup changes, and I think it's because Edge and Bono changed their names from the original kind of days to their stage monikers at some point. So the person's like, the lineup changes were... I'm like, they never changed the lineup once. These guys have been the same 4 cats since Remembrance Day, and not really goes back to 7. It's ridiculous. Duran Duran, undoubtedly one of the most influential bands of the 80s. Again, not American. The Cure, Radiohead, some of the greatest metal bands in the legacy of Black Sabbath, like Priest, Iron Maiden, AC/DC, who are from Australia. None of those groups can be in this greatest American group of all time. And so a lot of the contestants that we think, no, they're not. So that leaves the Who is in the running for the greatest American band. And I'm going to show you that next. Again, these are not really in any specific order. These last half dozen or so are definitely not the greatest American bands, but they just... Nine Inch Nails deserves a mention. They certainly had a big impact. Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Nirvana. Someone's surely going to mention Nirvana, but they're not in the same landscape as those great British bands we were talking about from my perspective and understanding, influence, how they changed music. Red Hot Chili Peppers, nice group. Key Just Can't Sing. Not the greatest American band of all time. Just not. The Byrds, they had some influence. They did that country rock thing for a while. Psychedelic rock before that. They're not in the same ballpark as the Beatles, Stones, Floyd, Zeppelin. They're just not. Jefferson Airplane, same thing. Nice little group, some great little songs. Their legacy is definitely firm, but for me, Jefferson Airplane can't be the greatest American band of all time, can they? But that's just it. Almost every one of these groups, you go, really? That's Velvet Underground. Short window, 4 records. Lou Reed's career after that's much longer, but as much as I love some Velvet Underground, they're not the greatest American band of all time. Frank Zappa and the Mothers. I love the Mothers. Their first 3 records, Absolutely Free, Rolling In It for the Money, and Freak Out, are absolutely centerpieces of the counter movement. There was the counterculture in the 60s, and Zappa was the counterculture. He's like, you guys are clowns, all a bunch of followers, sheep, bah. He made so much fun of the plastic people. as it was happening. And that takes a lot more insight, and there's a lot more credit when you're making fun of something as it's happening, as it's hip, as it's cool. It's easy to make fun of disco when everybody else is. To make fun of the hippie movement years later. But to make fun of those things in that moment takes a little bit more foresight and perspective. And Zappa really nails the whole counterculture thing and really dissects it and makes a mockery of it, really. Lynyrd Skynyrd, great little band. Not in the top 10 greatest bands of all time for me. And they're certainly not the greatest American band of all time. Creedence Clearwater. Now we're getting somewhere here. I'm a big Creedence Clearwater guy. Oh, sorry, Buffalo Springfield. This is Creedence Clearwater. I love Buffalo Springfield. Again, they suffer from the same fate as the Velvets and Creedence do. Short-lived careers, gone pretty quickly. Buffalo does 3 records, maybe 4 with some outtakes. Creedence makes 5 or 6 great records in about a 3-year window, and then they're gone. And Creedence's impact is undeniable. That country rock garage sound that's just still being done today. Creedence is a very important, impactful group. Whether they fit at the top of the pantheon, I don't think you can put Creedence there, but they're certainly in the mix. ZZ Top. Another one of those groups with several different eras. Their early 70s blues records are outstanding. I really enjoy those early ZZ Top records. And then their 80s pop crossover records were really fun. But again, they're not in the Beatles, Floyd, Zeppelin pantheon. Aerosmith, a great replica of the Stones, the same formula, the same rock and roll, the same borrowing from the Albert Kings and the blues. They had several different lives, Aerosmith. One of the greatest American bands, without question, to me, is Aerosmith. I still don't put them in with any of those British bands. They're more down the Black Sabbath tier, maybe. The Doors. Love the Doors. Big fan of the Doors. Spent years with the Doors and LSD. Strange Days. LA Woman, the first record. I love some of their live stuff. I think it's just really entrancing. And Jim is a character live. He's unpredictable, no question. His lyrics might be a whole different set of poetry today. But there's times where he's also just a stumbling, bumbling drunk. And they also suffer from the same fate as the Creedences and the Buffalo Springfields, where they were around rather short. It's a rather small window where the Doors were really a thing. Their legacy is much greater, but their impact is fairly big, but their career is very, very short. Allman Brothers, who were beset by tragedy on all sides, losing band members consistently. Big Allman Brothers fan. Killing Floor is amazing. There's a lot of great Allman Brothers tracks. But they're Southern rock. They're kind of limited to one thing. Their innovations weren't groundbreaking. They didn't change the world. Again, so I don't think Allman Brothers can be in that top 10 or number 1 greatest American band either. Jimi Hendrix. Love Jimmy. Hearing him now, he sounds a little different to me now than he once did. He sounds a little sloppier, a little more out of time, but the feel and the groove and the pulse, he's absolutely got at that. But he had to go to England to make it, and his bandmates, at least those early records, were British kids. And so you really can't call Jimi Hendrix the greatest American band of all time. And again, we're talking a fairly small window. He made 3 or 4 records before his passing, and then there's 700 things posthumously, none of which measure up to those original 3 records. Grateful Dead. Grateful Dead for me would be one of my favorite American bands of all time. The way they do American roots music and bring, folk, country, the blues, all these different elements of American roots music to life, and everything becomes deadified. Everything they do sounds like a Dead song somehow, partly because of Jerry and his scales and how he plays. There's just a certain bubbling brook of joy that is Jerry Garcia. I'm the hugest Garcia fan. I can listen to him and just feel his little stories and narrations happening. I love the storytelling, and to me, Robert Hunter is one of the greatest lyricists of all time, the unofficial member of the group. I love Bobby Weir. I love Brent Midland in the 80s. What a great singer he was, backing up both Bobby and Jerry. great harmonies that really help bring those songs to life, because Jerry's voice was weaker and thinner, and Bobby's voice is excitable and full of passion. But when you have that lovely gospel-tinged sound of Brent Midland bringing those harmonies to life, making those songs so much richer, listen to Without a Net from 1989 and listen to some of those versions of those songs and listen to what Brent Midland brings to the table. It's really groundbreaking, just in terms of how much it changes the sound of the Dead. I loved a lot of the 60s Dead, but it's very psych and Pigpen and the blues, and it's very hit or miss from track to track how great I think they are. The early 70s kind of country rock, American Beauty, Working Man's Dead, are outstanding records. And then I think the stuff that comes next on Skeleton and the Roses and Europe 72, a lot of that's not, it's their live records and it's new material being performed live. I think some of those songs suffer from not having a studio version. And I think there's a great missing Grateful Dead record from 72 that would cover a lot of those songs. That might be one of their greatest records ever if it was to be made. I still love the late 70s stuff with Keith and Donna, but Donna can really peel my paint at times when she's streaking in her. So it's really the Brent Midland years for me that are the most magical. But what they're doing today with the young kid playing guitar, I was pretty impressed by that. But I don't think the Dead belong with Floyd, Zeppelin, Queen, the Beatles, the Stones. They're the Dead, and they're not trying to be in that pantheon at all. Next on my list would be Santana. I picked a pretty weird Santana record here. This is Lotus. It's a 3 LP Japanese release of a live concert. Carlos Santana is a brilliant player whose career's had several lives. He really came back to the fore in the early 2000s with some of that newer, what's that song he did with Rob? It's a great song. It really is. It got played to death, but it's a great song. Big fan of Santana. His early records, Black Magic Woman. There's a lot of hits. Accessibility, Latin rock. Are they the greatest American band of all time? We're getting closer to maybe. Maybe that's who it is. Steely Dan. 6 or 7 great records. They weren't a live act for most of their career. They were just a studio band. So none of that live energy of a live rock and roll band was ever a part of their career. It doesn't deter from the fact they're great songwriters, great producers. They know how to add the right elements to songs. And I think Steely Dan's records really stand the test of time really well. The production is immaculate, both from a production standpoint and an arrangement standpoint. It's both really high marks. Top greatest American band of all time, Steely Dan? Don't think you get a lot of people who would sign off on that. Van Halen. Again, if we say Van Halen's the greatest American band of all time, it's going to lead to some consternation. And yet, Van Halen does have some great records, both the Van Hagar and the Van Halen eras. Great songwriting, some of the greatest guitar playing the world's ever seen. Eddie was a pretty brilliant guy. Alex is a great drummer. Michael Anthony Roth and actually Hagar is one of the most talented second men in a band you've ever had. Hagar's a great songwriter, a great singer, brought a lot of synergy to the band, harmonies. I'm a big Hagar guy, even though those records probably aren't as groundbreaking as the stuff done with David Lee Roth. Van Halen is definitely a top 10 American band, but they're certainly not number 1. The Eagles. The Eagles. The Eagles. The Eagles. Oh man, the Eagles, to quote the Big Lebowski, you gotta love the Eagles even if you hate the Eagles. And they're very middle of the road, sold very well. Hotel California is, a landmark song that I put on DJ sets all the time. If there's a lot of middle-aged kind of yacht club people in the room, throw in some Hotel California and they'll all sing along, playing the drum parts, and it's a pretty ubiquitous track. Shows up all over throughout the last 30, 40 years. And there's numerous tracks that the Eagles do that fit that billing. They're certainly an important group. They certainly sold well. Influentially, I don't think they had the same impact as the Beatles or Zeppelin or Floyd in terms of changing the sound of music. They're certainly part of that country rock wave that comes in the early 70s, and they certainly had a big impact. And I would think it's pretty safe to say that the Eagles are a top 5 American band. And I'm not the biggest Eagles fan, but as I've gotten older, I've appreciated their records more. Great playing, great production. Hell freezes over. Before they're the greatest American band of all time, but they're definitely in the mix. Now, one that I think people are going to be like, really? Metallica. And this was a record that changed my life back in 9th, 10th grade. I loved Master of Puppets. I remember writing little essays about it in Canada in my English classes and stuff, talking about what the songs meant. Battery, Damage Incorporated. I loved it. And they were incredibly underground at this point, which is something people forget. Metallica, the band that we know of today, that's a rather mainstream, played at a hockey game, played at an NFL game. You'll hear Enter Sandman, or even some of the older stuff like Ride the Lightning. You'll hear some of these tracks, which is very much in contrast to where these songs were when they were coming out. You would hear Van Halen Jump, but you wouldn't hear Master of Puppets at a public gathering. The band was very under the radar. Even in America, they were very much second or third tier in terms of sales popularity. They were never on the radio. They weren't on MTV. And Justice for All changes that with One, and that video and that circulation really kind of boosts their reputation. And then, of course, they follow that up with the Great Black record, which is a different sounding Metallica, but it was a very accessible Metallica. Bob Rock made sure that the bass is much more pronounced in the mix, which gives it much more of a low end. And you end up with one of the great rock records of that era, and of any era. And Metallica sold a lot of records. They can still pack stadiums, which there's not a lot of bands in the world can do that. People don't even think about that, how much things have changed in the music business. With the destruction of the album sales and the destruction of the major labels, the big concert tours in stadiums don't really exist. You can play theaters again, maybe an arena, but even most arena shows, from what I see in the papers and stuff, are half filled nowadays. You don't get sold out arenas 4 nights a whole lot. A guy like Garth Brooks could come back and sell out 5 nights in Target Center, which is weird. But the stadiums, I don't know if you're European folks, but here in America, arenas are 15 to 20,000 people, kind of. Stadiums are at that next level of 40 to 60, 70,000, upwards of 100,000 for some college football and football venues. So that's a different beast to play a stadium. And those days of playing stadiums, the Stones can do it. Pink Floyd could probably do it, even though we're down to Nicky and David, and Roger and David ain't going to ever shake hands and do that together, as far as I'm told and understand. But not a lot of the great rock bands have the capacity nowadays to have that kind of power or that kind of money behind them. It's just such a splintered industry nowadays. In some ways, the best days are behind us. It's a lot more independent stuff to come to the fore, but independent stuff has its yin and yang, pros and cons. There's a lot of really poorly produced, lacking the big budget to do things the right way. A lot of it's just studio sampling, and the days of a real string section coming in and laying some stuff on top of something are just gone. And so all those great American bands, none of them really climb into that pantheon. The one that probably is number one for me, and probably for a lot of people when they think about it, will probably be the Beach Boys. And again, a band with several careers. Their early surf stuff is really fluffy and light and saccharine, but it's fun. And most people know half dozen of those songs just from living. 409, Surfing Safari, Surfing USA, California Girls. Those songs are just ubiquitous and kind of creep into your mind. Just living life. You hear them and see them. They pop up in films. So you get to know that era of the Beach Boys pretty well. But they certainly had a second era in the late 60s, early 70s that was much more psychedelic, much more country rock even. Those Hall and Amsterdam, some of those records were really Smile, Honey, they made some pretty interesting stuff. And while you wouldn't really consider Beach Boys to be rock and roll, there's certain stuff, Surf's Up, where they had a band element going on, and they were much more than just the surf stuff from the early big hits days. So, again, Beach Boys aren't a slam dunk either. They're not rock and roll in that sense, but they're one of the greatest American bands, no question. And so, last I'm going to show you an album that for me is probably my favorite American band. I wouldn't lobby for them to be the greatest American band of all time because, again, a short career, and but they had a lot of impact, and that's Rage Against the Machine. I love Rage. I think all three of their records are just such important records. They influenced all the new metal and rap metal that kind of came after them, but the difference being Zach De La Rocha knew what he was mad about, where a lot of the other metal singers don't really know what they're mad about, they just know they're mad. And so all those Slipknots and Korns and all those new metal bands, Limp Bizkit, they're mad about something, you know, who knows what. Sometimes they even lie about what they're mad about. But these guys always knew what they were upset about. And like I said, I don't think I would put them in the top 10 greatest bands of all time, but they're certainly one of my favorite American bands. So that's an interesting question for you guys to query. What is the greatest American band of all time? It's not the slam dunk that you think it's going to be. There's not this obvious, like, oh yeah, Beatles, Stones, Zeppelin, Floyd, all those great bands are British. AC/DC was Australian. The band is from Canada is better than most of the bands that we just talked about. They had a decent long career, made some great records, some great songs, really kind of set this table for all the roots, Trampled by Turtles kind of alternative folk rock stuff with weird instruments and roots music that's going on. The band really kind of opened that doorway up. You know, if you watch the band, those guys all played every instrument, and they brought all kinds of weird ones on the stage with them as well. So the band's impact is really, really greater than people realize. They suffer from a degree of anonymity, partly because of their band, the name, the band. So people could often be talking about the band, and no one really knows what band you're talking about. The band. And of course they played with Dylan on that groundbreaking tour in '65. Basement Tapes. Incredible stuff. So the band's one of the great bands from North America, without question, but they're not an American band. So what is the greatest American band? And I've spent hours debating this in a friendly kind of topical conversation. You don't want to get too heated. It's just fun. But a lot of times people don't realize that most of the greatest bands of all time are all British. And why is that? And I'm going to wrap it up by just sharing a few thoughts. I think partly it's because a lot of those British bands are borrowing from American black music. They feel the soul and the guts of the ugly history that's happened here, and those blues records and early R&B records are coming across as 45s, and Mick and Keith and Paul and John and Entwistle, these guys were all buying those early 45s of the blues and the black musicians, and they did a wonderful job reinterpreting it and bringing it to America. So that makes the American version of that stuff kind of more of a regurgitation, almost like a third feeding compared to the second feeding that is the British stuff, and the first feeding, which is the original black American music, which most Americans shied away from in droves in terms of the masses. That's also another thing, is that a lot of these rock and roll records were associated with black music and black roots, and there was still a strong anti-black sentiment in America. There still is. So I think people stayed away from rock and roll because of the conservative nature of the church and the condemnation of their peers. But I think the biggest reason why American rock bands don't have that long-term success and become the greatest bands of all time, it's because of the size of the music industry here. It's such a big, powerful machine that you're just a single cog in, and if your little cog breaks, we have so many more facets of this machine that we won't even bother to replace you. We'll just shut that branch down. And I think what happens here is that a lot of bands are doing their thing, having unique sounds and maybe great songwriting and maybe their potential to be a great band. But what's hot right now might be hair metal or glam or alternative or grunge. And so you get shaped and modeled into those new sounds if you want to get signed. You can be in obscurity who you are, but if you want to get to the mainstream, you probably have to allow some gimmickry to come in. And gimmickry and mimicry has a short shelf life. Innovators can often stand the test of time, but those who imitate often get forgotten quickly and they become just image-based. And eventually that trend is going to go away. And because you're associated with that trend, your career will often fade away with it as well. And I think that's a big part of what's happened to a lot of bands. Secondly, I think the big American record labels are just fine with signing a new batch of bands every 5, 6, 7 years. When you have to re-sign a band after their first, second, third contracts, those numbers start becoming incredibly big if it's a great, powerful band. So instead of having big, powerful, wealthy bands, you just sign new ones every 5 years and repackage them for the next generation of kids, like you would a new school look. Today's 8th graders, when they're seniors, are going to look a whole lot different than today's seniors. You got to have new things to make them feel like they have their own identity. And so the record industry in this country has been very shallow, very commercial, very image-based. And so I think that makes a lot of bands attached to sounds that really weren't their sound or looks that really weren't their look. And they get dismissed and not re-signed. And the Aerosmiths who can be re-signed over and over again are the exception. And look at the money Aerosmith is getting for the last 5, 6, 7 records they've made. Huge $1 million numbers that the industry can't really even afford nowadays. Things have changed so dramatically. And so what you have is all these infinite little groups with little followings, playing little spaces. And as a DJ, I can tell you, it's not like it was in the 90s where everybody knew TLC. You know, it's a very different thing now where people know a small pocket of things. So it's just an interesting question, nothing serious. What is your favorite what's the greatest American band of all time? And if you could, create for me your 10 greatest bands of all time list. We're talking rock and roll, you know. And lastly, I want to say, all of this goes to illustrate the legacy of Black American music. It really does. It shows you that all the rock and roll that we love has its roots in that black music, which a lot of it came through the lens of the European invasions. But jazz, the blues, rhythm and blues, early rock and roll, it's black music driven by the oppression and suffering of a people that created this joyful sound that transcends. And the greatest American music is jazz, the blues, Muddy Waters, Prince, the OJs, you know, all those great rhythm and blues groups, Curtis Mayfield, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Frankie Beverly. It's a pretty endless list. Rhythm and blues, Soul Cats, and then before the Soul Cats, you have the great Ray Charles, Louis Jordan, and then this whole mishmash of jazz and blues that fills up the first half of the 20th century. That's the great American music. And ask the Japanese, ask the Europeans what the great American music is. It's black music from America. That was often more popular elsewhere and still sells elsewhere. And a lot of it's forgotten here today still. And then on top of all that, America has this pop industry that's packaging black ripped off music once again. You know, Britney Spears is black music, just done really candy-like, really polished with a pretty girl out in front. But that's a groove, that's a rhythm and blues sound that comes straight from black music. And that's what a lot of Americans associate with, is that pop, dance, chart music. And that stuff has a really short shelf life. You can only be a pop star for so long. Now, I don't care how great you are, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, Beyonce, your window will close as the next generation of kids come up. And sadly, nowadays, it's Cardi B and Nicki Minaj that's kind of holding that pop R&B female legacy, and that's scary, icky waters, if you ask me. So, again, just a fun, lightheaded conversation. something I've had umpteen times when I'm trying to kill time with people. And I'm kind of surprised when I thought about it. I'm like, I've never made an episode about that. I need to. So, what's your 10 favorite band? What's the 10 greatest bands of all time? Rock and roll. And what's the highest ranked American band on that list? And don't put some band that you love that no one's heard of. That can't be on this list. This has to be a band that people know, has a legacy, stuff stays in print, people wear t-shirts of it. It's got to have that kind of staying power. Even the punk rock bands, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, UK. So what is that American legacy band? What's the band that stands above the rest of the American bands? Is it Metallica? Is it the Beach Boys? Let me know. Go to my merch store, grab a hoodie for the holidays. Appreciate the support. Patreon, if you want to support the channel with a small donation every month, that helps out my family. Very much appreciated. You all be safe. Have a great day. Put your thinking caps on. I want some good answers. Peace.